Most people assume that wartime cooking rises and falls with access to fuel. No stove means no hot food, and no hot food means collapse. That assumption is wrong, and it shaped many fatal mistakes in 20th century warfare. Across World War II, millions of civilians, partisans, prisoners, and even regular soldiers survived long stretches without firewood, liquid fuel, or proper cooking equipment. They did not do this by heroism or improvisation alone, but by reviving older, quieter knowledge that industrial societies had nearly forgotten. Before we go further, if this kind of overlooked history matters to you, subscribe to the Survival Record. This channel exists for people who care about how survival actually worked, not how it's usually summarized. What follows is not about clever tricks. It's about systems, constraints, and lessons that still matter. People relearned that cooking does not require continuous heat if insulation does the work. One of the most widespread yet rarely discussed wartime methods was thermal retention cooking, often called haybox cooking. The principle is simple and ancient. Food is brought briefly to a boil using any temporary heat source, sometimes scavenged industrial steam, sometimes a shared communal flame, and then sealed inside heavy insulation to finish cooking slowly. During the Second World War, this method reappeared across occupied Europe, especially in cities where fuel was rationed or confiscated. Households used crates packed with straw sawdust clothing or shredded paper. Once sealed, stews and grains could cook for hours without additional fuel. The critical insight was not thrift, but predictability. Insulated cooking reduced smoke, reduced time exposed near heat sources, and allowed cooking to happen during short, safe windows. Post-war civil defense manuals quietly incorporated the same principle, recognizing that fuel denial would be a defining feature of modern war. Sunlight became a usable cooking resource long before modern solar ovens. Solar cooking did not begin in the 1970s. During World War II, particularly in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and parts of Asia, both civilians and military units experimented with reflective solar setups using scrap metal, mirrors, and polished cookware. These were not novelty devices. They were situational tools used when smoke discipline mattered, or when fuel simply did not exist. Solar cooking worked best for slow foods, grains, thin stews, and water purification. Its advantage was invisibility. No flame, no smell of burning fuel, no supply chain. Its limitation was time, which wartime schedules rarely allowed. Still, the method resurfaced whenever people had sunlight but nothing else. Modern survival doctrine often treats solar cooking as optional. World War II showed it could be decisive under the right constraints. Chemical heat quietly filled the gap when fire was impossible. Although often associated with later conflicts, chemical self-heating food containers existed before and during World War II in limited but significant forms. The most common mechanism involved quicklime reacting with water to produce heat. Certain German and Japanese field experiments used this approach for heating rations or water without open flame, particularly for naval or air crews. More often than not, civilians actually used industrial byproducts like lime, carbide residues, or, other reactive materials under pretty controlled conditions. These things were dangerous if mishandled, which is probably why documentation on their use is, rather sparse. But the principle really mattered. Heat could be generated chemically, silently, and indoors. This idea directly influenced post-war military research into flameless ration heaters, and honestly, it still remains a cornerstone of modern field feeding systems. engines ended up replacing kitchens wherever vehicles still functioned. One of the most common yet rarely acknowledged cooking surfaces of the war was actually the engine block. Trucks, tanks, tractors and generators all produced reliable waste heat, making them, well, surprisingly effective for cooking. Soldiers would wrap their food in cloth or paper and then place it near the exhaust manifolds or radiator housings. Civilians, did pretty much the same thing with agricultural machinery. This wasn't really about desperation, it was more about, logistics awareness. Engines were running anyway, so their heat was both predictable and concealable. Cooking on vehicles actually allowed food preparation while on the move, eliminated any competition for fuel, and reduced exposure for everyone involved. Modern military field manuals still acknowledge this practice, though usually as an emergency measure. But the Second World War really proved it could be a routine thing. Not all cooking actually requires heat. Acid, time and water can, render food edible and digestible. During the Second World War, populations that lacked fuel, they relied heavily on cold-soaking grains, legumes and dried foods. Vinegar, fermented liquids, or even sour fruit juices were often used to soften and partially denature proteins. This method appears frequently in prisoner accounts and siege conditions. It was slower and, less palatable, but it preserved nutrition. The lesson was not culinary, it was metabolic. Heat improves efficiency, but survival depends on absorption, not comfort. Cold preparation methods informed later research into emergency rations and no-cook food planning. Fermentation surged during World War II, not as tradition, but really out of necessity. Without fuel for boiling or drying, people relied on controlled microbial processes to make food safer and longer lasting. Vegetables were fermented in cellars, trenches, and even buried containers. Grains were sprouted or soured to improve digestibility. Fermentation required time and knowledge, but almost no resources. It also produced minimal detectable signatures. In occupied regions, this mattered. Post-war nutrition science would later confirm what civilians already knew. Fermented foods preserve calories and micronutrients under extreme constraints. One of the most unsettling but, practical adaptations involved residual heat from bombed infrastructure. Rubble, masonry and metal would actually retain heat for hours after air raids or industrial shutdowns. Civilians sometimes used this heat to warm or even partially cook food, all without lighting fires. This was not common, but it was in fact documented. It reflected a broader wartime reality. People learned to treat energy as something to be captured, not generated. That mindset really influenced later disaster response planning and urban survival studies during the Cold War. These cooking methods were not clever tricks. They were, in fact, responses to systems designed to deny heat, fuel, and visibility. World War II showed that survival favors those who, understand energy, time, and adaptation better than their opponents. Remembering these practices matters because, honestly, modern crises still follow the same patterns: fuel scarcity, infrastructure loss, and enforced invisibility. If you value this kind of grounded historical analysis, please subscribe to The Survival Record and share this video with others who want more than surface-level history.